Okay, so carrying on from where we were on before, I think what we have here, the kind old son will know, is um, also like using the reference, the play on the word and the reference to son. I think there's an idea that, you know, Jesus is the Son of God, the Son itself, the Son here is symbolic of God. Um, Jesus laid down his life for others, rose from the dead, uh, and also, as we know, cause a miracle to allow Lazarus to rise. We've got the two miracles happening here: the idea of Lazarus rising from the dead, and also the idea of soldiers laying down their lives for others, and the possibility of resurrection. That's the whole of the religious symbolism there. Um, but there's also the anthropomorphism of kind, old son, and and the knowledge there as well. Okay, moving on. I'm sorry about the noise in the background. It's the Lego movie. Um, okay, moving on to the second stanza. It kind of carries on from, well, it does carry on from the first stanza. Think how it wakes the seeds. So the kind old son will know. Think how it wakes the seeds. So now we've got to think, who is being directed now? Who are they talking to? Is this a conversation that's continued on from up here? Are we talking to the same person, or are we now directing? Is Owen now directing the reader and talking to the reader? Think how it wakes the seeds. We have that continuation of the wakes here, and the seeds, the lexical chain we sown up here, and the idea of generation, fertility. Um, and that continues on. You know, the hyphen allows us to continue on to the next line. It woke once the clays of a cold star. So we're still talking about the sun here. And we have the alliteration of clays and cold, that harsh, hard sound. Um, yes, so the clays of a cold star, we've got a couple of things happening here. We've got the oxymoron of cold star. Of course, a star itself is a form of sun, and we have the idea of perhaps the scientific idea of creation at this point. But clay is also a biblical allusion to Genesis, and the idea that in the Bible we get the idea that Adam is from clay, that humanity is made from clay by God, and then it's links it with making it from a cold star, so bringing life to this cold planet. Uh, our limbs so dear achieved, our sides full nerves still warm, too hard to stir. Okay, our limbs so dear achieved, our sides full nerves still warm, too hard to stir. So now we've got a shift in the poem here. The first stanza in this, the hope continues here, and now we have a shift. The rhetorical questions change the tone of the poem, and we start towards moving towards the despair of this poem and finding out what it is that is considered to be futile. Our limbs so dear achieved. Our limbs, we've got two connotations here. One, we've got the limbs of the body, the arms and the legs of the body, and also the limbs perhaps of a tree, which links to the seeds, and the idea of vegetation and fertility. Um, and so just going back to this part here as well, we also have the links to the fertility and the old the antiquity kind of beliefs of how fertility came about and being sculpted from clay. Um, and so we got an idea of the pagan gods in there as well. And so back to our limbs. So we could be talking about a tree and talking about humanity as well. But it's these extensions, this growth that's coming. So dear achieved. So dear, there's a dear, the beauty of the word dear, it kind of goes with this gentility and the whispering up here. And yet there's also the idea that there's a value to it as well. There is a value there. Our limbs so dear achieved, our sides full nerved, still warm, too hard to stir. So the idea of the nerves working through the body, and then the warmth that comes from the sun. The body's still warm. There is still the possibility that he could be alive. Too hard to stir. So the rhetorical question is like still not wanting to give up that disbelief that he could possibly be dead. And then was it for this clay? Was it for this the clay grew tall? Again, that's linking straight to here and the idea of creation and humanity and this moment where we're saying, what is the point? Is this the reason for our existence to kill all these soldiers whilst at war? And then we have this greater moment, and then we move into the onomatopoeic oh, this wailing sound. It's so emotional. Oh, what made fatuous sunbeams toil to break earth's sleep at all. Links to up here, we didn't mention it before, but up here we have these long sounding vowels. At home, whispering of fields half sown. It's emotive language. When we've got those long vowels, it becomes a um, emotive, and there's an assonance there. Home, sown, snow, no, oh. So there's this assonance work and woke working its way through the poem. Oh, what made fatuous sunbeams toil? Again, this idea of futility coming out in the word fatuous here. And the idea that what the sun is doing is completely pointless. So oh, what made fatuous sunbeams toil to break earth's sleep at all. And so you can see with this final rhetorical question here, and of course, sleep being linked to rouse and woke and everything else previously, is the idea that the pointlessness, the futility is no longer just in the war, but the futility of existing in the first place. What's the point of existing if all we can do is go to war and kill all these men? Um, Big shifts in this poem, though. We have the idea that, what's missing is the military discourse. We do have the word France, but there's nothing otherwise to suggest that this could be, um, it may not necessarily be in a battlefield. There's nothing really there to indicate that he's apart from the reference to France. Um, and yet, by being so gentle in the way it's structured and in the language itself and in that rhythm that comes from those long vowel sounds, move him into the sun gently. Its touch awoke him once at home, whispering of fields half sown. Always it woke him, even in France. Listen to those long vowel sounds, the assonance of the O sound, and it gives us this gentle, soft, caring rhythm. So the tone of this is very different to the other poems in terms of the musicality of it and the emotion of it, and yet there is this utter despair at the end of this poem, and this idea that the pointlessness, the futility is not just about the war itself, but about existence. And we said in class today, it kind of preempts existentialism. Existentialism was to come later, but it's kind of there already. And contextually, we know from Owen's letters that he had written to his mum in 1917. This poem was written in the spring of 1918, but in the winter of 1917, he wrote to his mum about how he felt when he realised that a man had died overnight just from the cold of the snow. And speaking of which, notice the links between cold and snow up here that's coming through, and this absolute pointless moment of despair and futility, questioning the very existence, even the irony of going to the front and dying before you even get to face the battle as well. And it shows you it's another look at the war itself and another level of it, in that the war was completely unforgiving. It wasn't enough that there was gas, and there wasn't enough that there was the bullets that they had to contend with and the mines they had to contend with. It was also just the elements themselves. And so we have this pathetic fallacy coming through, with the sun creating the emotion, and the idea that the sun is supposed to give life. We're meant to regenerate. We're meant to have that life cycle, and he's here asking, what's the absolute point? There's also with the seeds, the metaphor of the seeds, and the extended metaphor there is not just talking about fertility, but also about this is the youth. A generation of men were lost. They're meant to go and procreate. They're meant to go and continue generation, and that failed. Anyway, this is just an extension of what we did in class today. Use that with the annotations that have been sent around as well, and see what links that you can find with Dolce and Anthem and the other poems we're about to do. One big thing is the in here we had the gently moving him, whereas in Dolce they it's into the wagons that they had been flung. So the different regard for how the bodies are used, and here there's something religious in how they're trying to raise him from the dead, and compare that to what's happening in Anthem, where there's this mourning for the loss of the funeral itself. So there's different ideas of futility that is going on here. Okay, good luck for your HSC.